1,000 years of church history, the largest split in the history of Christianity. Catholicism on one side, Protestantism on the other. 2 billion people divided. In the entire division, every doctrine, every council, every reformation, every war that followed hinges on one verse in one gospel, and the difference between two Greek words that look almost identical, Petros and Petra. If those two words mean the same thing, the Catholic reading of the Church is right. If they mean different things, the Protestant reading is right. And almost no one teaching this verse tells you the third thing, the geography underneath both words that changes how you should read the whole conversation. Let me show you. Welcome back to Scripture Underground. Today we are reading Matthew chapter 16, Beneath the Surface, and we are starting with a verse you have heard since childhood that contains a fight worth 1,000 years. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the rest of the series. Let's go. Here is the sentence. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Matthew chapter 16, verse 18. You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. In English, those two words, Peter and rock, look like a play on words. Peter, the rock, the disciple, the foundation. It reads like a compliment from Jesus to his most outspoken follower. And from that one sentence, the Catholic Church draws this conclusion. Peter himself is the rock, the foundation of the entire Church, the first in an unbroken line of successors, the first pope. That is the claim. That is the doctrine of Petrine succession. Everything from the office of the papacy to the authority of Rome to the very structure of the Catholic Church traces its root back to this one verse. And the entire Protestant Reformation 500 years ago was, in part, a refusal to accept that reading. Because in the original Greek, Jesus is not saying what your English Bible makes it sound like he is saying. Look at the Greek. You are. And here Jesus uses the word Petros, masculine, a proper name. You are Petros, Peter. Then immediately he says, and on this, and here he uses a different word, Petra, feminine, a common noun. You are Petros, and on this Petra I will build my church. In English, both words get translated as rock, and the distinction disappears. In Greek, the distinction is in plain sight. Two different forms, two different grammatical genders, sitting one word apart in the same sentence. And this is where it gets contested. There are two main readings, and they have been at war for 1,000 years. First, the Catholic reading. Petros and Petra are the same word in different forms. Jesus called Peter by the masculine Petros because Peter is a man, then used the feminine Petra because the noun rock is grammatically feminine in Greek. Same idea, same referent. You are the rock, and on this rock I will build my church. Peter is the foundation, full stop. Then the Protestant reading. Petros and Petra are two different words with two different meanings. In classical Greek literature, Homer, Plato, the playwrights, Petros often refers to a smaller, movable stone, and Petra refers to a massive, immovable bedrock. Jesus is making a deliberate contrast. You are a stone, Peter, but on this bedrock I will build my church. And the bedrock is not Peter. The bedrock is the confession Peter just made. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Both readings have serious scholarly defenders. Both have been argued for centuries. And honestly, the Greek grammar alone does not settle it. People who tell you it does are oversimplifying. The lexical case for a sharp, small stone versus bedrock distinction in first-century Koine Greek is genuinely contested. So if the Greek alone does not settle the question, what does? Two things. The first is something Jesus probably wasn't speaking in Greek. The second is where he was standing when he said it. Jesus did not preach in Greek. He preached in Aramaic. Greek is the language Matthew wrote the Gospel in, but the conversation, as it actually happened on that hillside, was in Aramaic. And in Aramaic, the word for rock is Kepha. Kepha. That is the same word the Apostle John records Jesus using earlier in the Gospels when he first renamed Simon. Kepha. Cephas. The Aramaic for rock. So when Jesus stands in front of Peter in Matthew 16, what he most likely actually says in Aramaic is this: "You are Kepha, and on this Kepha I will build my church." The same word, twice. Which means the Greek text we have is Matthew's translation choice. Matthew had a problem. Aramaic doesn't have grammatical gender problems. Greek does. Kepha is a single Aramaic noun, but in Greek you cannot give a man a feminine noun as his name. So Matthew uses the masculine Petros for the name and the feminine Petra for the noun. Not because Jesus used two different words, but because Greek grammar required two different forms. That is honestly the strongest argument that the two words refer to the same thing. But here is what almost no one teaching this verse tells you. The argument about which word means what is not actually where the real reveal is. The real reveal is where Jesus was standing when he said it. Matthew tells us very specifically where this conversation happened. Now when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, Matthew chapter 16, verse 13. Caesarea Philippi. Most Bible readers blow right past that location. They picture some generic hillside, a vague Galilean landscape. But Matthew did not have to name the place. He named the place because the place is part of the meaning. Caesarea Philippi sat about 25 miles north of the Sea of Galilee, at the base of Mount Hermon, on the northernmost edge of where Jewish people lived. It was not a Jewish city. It was a pagan center, and the specific spot Jesus took his disciples to was one of the most religiously notorious locations in the entire ancient Near East. There was a cliff, a massive wall of bedrock, and at the base of that cliff was a cave, a deep, water-filled cavern from which the headwaters of the Jordan River flowed. For centuries, that cave had been considered a sacred site by pagan worshippers. The Greeks dedicated it to the god Pan, half man, half goat, and built a temple complex into the rock itself. Pilgrims came to offer sacrifices. The worship was sexually grotesque. The temple was lined with niches carved into the cliff face, each holding a statue of a different deity. And the cave at the base of the cliff had a specific nickname in the ancient world: the Gates of Hades. In Greek mythology, the pagans believed this cave was a literal entrance to the underworld. They sacrificed animals by throwing them into the water and watching whether the blood ran back out. If the cave swallowed the offering, the gods were pleased. If the blood appeared in the springs below, the gods were angry. The cave was, in the religious imagination of the day, a portal between the world of the living and the world of the dead. That is where Jesus chose to ask his disciples the most important question of his ministry. Who do people say that I am? Then, who do you say that I am? And Peter, standing in front of the cliff, in the shadow of a pagan temple, with the literal gates of Hades behind him, says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And then, only then, Jesus says, "On this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it." He is not speaking abstractly. He is pointing. That gate, that cave, that entire religious system carved into that cliff face, none of it will hold against what I am about to build. Once you see the location, the Petros Petra fight starts to look smaller. Because watch what changes. If the rock Jesus is pointing at is the cliff face itself, the massive limestone wall behind him, the most famous bedrock in that part of the world, on which an entire pagan religious empire had been carved, then the symbolism is enormous. That cliff was the literal foundation of pagan worship in the region. Statues of false gods were carved into it. The gates of Hades opened at its base. It was the rock the spiritual enemies of God had built their religion on. And Jesus is standing in front of it and saying, "On this kind of rock, but the right one, I will build something the gates of Hades cannot stand against." Suddenly the three readings, Peter or Peter's confession or Christ himself, start to look less like a fight and more like three lenses on the same scene. Peter, the disciple who just spoke the words, who will lead the church on the day of Pentecost, becomes a foundation stone. The confession, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God," becomes the bedrock truth on which everything else stands. Christ himself, the one being confessed, standing in front of a pagan cliff, declaring war on the kingdom of darkness, is the ultimate rock all the others point to. The Catholic instinct that Peter matters here is not crazy. The Protestant instinct that the confession is the foundation is not crazy. And the third reading, the geographic reading, pulls them both into focus. This was never just a grammar fight. It was a declaration of war, made in the most spiritually contested location in the region, against an entire pagan religious system that had been carved into a cliff for centuries. And the church Jesus said he would build has now outlived every god whose statue was carved into that cliff face. The temple at Caesarea Philippi is a tourist site now. The statues of Pan are fragments. The gates of Hades are a hiking destination. And the church Jesus declared he would build that day has spread to every continent on earth. He was right about the gates. Here is what most readers miss in their hurry to fight about Peter. Jesus did not make this declaration in a synagogue. He did not make it in Jerusalem. He did not make it in the safe places, surrounded by religious people who already believed. He made it at the front door of hell, pointing at the enemy's headquarters, surrounded by every false god the region had to offer. That is where he chose to say the words, "I will build my church," which means the church Jesus actually built is not the church that hides from the culture. It is not the church that flinches at the gates of hell. It is the church that walks up to them and says, "Not even this is going to hold." If you ever find yourself wondering whether the gospel still has teeth in a culture that increasingly does not believe, go back to Caesarea Philippi. Go back to the cliff. Look at the empty temple of Pan. And remember that the man who promised the church would outlast the gates of Hades has been right every single time. If this opened up Matthew 16 for you, hit like so more people see it. Subscribe for the rest of the series. And drop a comment below. Which reading of the rock makes the most sense to you? Keep digging. I'll see you in the next one.